pay off this huge debt.
And in some ways, the United States does this exact thing that they rebelled against 200 years ago. I found as an expatriate that your tax that you earn in a foreign country is liable to be taxed by the U.S. government, so you could be double taxed. Because and America is the only country on earth that does this. Their argument might be, well, you get the benefits of the global security umbrella of the United States, but it's a way to tax people who don't otherwise have representation. So I guess the moral of the story, I don't want to say that the ghost of George III is haunting us from beyond the grave, but more, if a government can tax people who don't have any other means to have any other recourse, they will. I guess that's just sort of a universal feature of humanity. I don't know.
I think that's pretty universal. And you can I can see it even in America. I mean, if you've ever stayed in a hotel or in a parking lot, you know the taxes there are way more expensive than any other taxes you pay on any other product or service. And the reason for that is out-of-staters stay in hotels. They're not represented in the legislature, and they're not going to be able to fight it.
Yeah, there you go. So the spirit of King George lives in all of us in different ways.
Oh, yeah.
So, and George too. I mean, is this the period where his mental illness is really starting to crank up? Do I have my time period right, or is that later?
No, that really is much later. George III he took office right at the end of the French and Indian War.
Oh, okay.
For the final years of the American Revolution, and he was really kind of seen as a bright, shining new light in Britain at the time. He was, I think, in his mid-20s. He had taken over from his grandfather. His father had predeceased him. He was the first king in several generations who spoke English as a first language and really took an interest in the English government. George I and George II were both born and raised in Germany. Hanover, which was a German state at the time. They both had German wives. They lived, most of their lives in Germany and considered themselves German princes who happened to have taken over England almost by accident. George III was born in England and raised in England and spoke English. He did take a German wife, but he was somebody who really took much more of an interest in government and governing, and at the same time respected the power and authority of Parliament. He did not want to become a despot or a tyrant or rule with an iron fist like the kings of old or something like that. He really was a big advocate of parliamentary rule, but saw his role as being an advocate for setting the course for the country and that sort of thing. And he really, I think, did a reasonably good job at it. As it turned out, the things he chose to do turned out to be poor policy, but they seemed very good at the time, and I think everybody was pretty happy with him.
He really lucked out, or not lucked out. He suffered the unfortunate luck of having one of the most important historical documents in history, the Declaration, spend a good amount of time talking about how terrible he is. So it's hard to live that down. But like you said, he has many good qualities, and I read something about him that he was one of the very few European monarchs who did not have a mistress, which in the 18th century, being a monarch and not having a mistress is, I was about to say that's on the level of being a bishop or cardinal in terms of personal piety, but I can't say that they would have been any better at this time. I don't know what's going on with the papacy at this time, but
it's probably better than a lot of the
it probably is. So he is, in terms of moral uprightness, he's doing well for himself.
He was actually a pretty simple guy in a lot of ways. He had no mistresses. He did not like carousing and drinking and that sort of thing. He actually ate the same meal almost every day for about 30 years. His simple mutton and turnip dish that was his dinner every single day, except for occasional, banquets that he had to do and was not particularly happy about.
Right. Was his nickname Farmer George?
Yeah, I think that is something that people call him behind his back.
All right, so George III. Well, yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that because we don't see things from the English side, but they're not doing these things in a vacuum. And
right.
And something that you spent a couple episodes on is the Coercive Acts or the intolerable acts. And again, anyone who remembers this is thinking of just a checklist of cruelty against the colonists and trying to exploit them, which you can definitely argue is the case, but there's rationale to it. Something you mentioned is that part of the strategy was an attempt to isolate Massachusetts, but it backfired. So what was the intended result of the Coercive Acts?
Okay, before I get into that, I want to say one more thing about King George. He was not really setting policy. He was letting Parliament set policy. So Parliament was the one making all these new taxes and doing all these things. And the king was basically letting Parliament do what Parliament was supposed to do. So the blame really should be on Parliament for this stuff, not the king. Now,
Right.
the king backed it up and agreed with it all later. And that's where we're going to get into the Coercive Acts. The Coercive Acts were a response to the Boston Tea Party, which hopefully everybody knows is Britain had a big tax on tea. They tried to foist the tea on the colonies, and the colonists threw the tea into the harbor because they didn't want to get tricked into paying this tax and then have that precedent of colonists pay taxes. So when that happened, the British saw this as an act of anarchy, chaos, defiance of government. And they thought that Massachusetts had to be held responsible for this act of destruction. And so they passed the Coercive Acts, which did a number of things. It closed Boston Harbor until the tea was paid for. They didn't explain who was going to pay for it or how, but they just closed the harbor. The other thing they did that was probably more offensive to the people of Massachusetts is they took away the right to hold town meetings and the right to elect the governor's council. So they were basically losing their right of self-government. And Britain was doing this as a way to show the rest of the colonies, well, if you behave poorly and defy us, this is what's going to happen to you. You're going to lose more rights. We're going to come down hard on you, and we're going to teach you a lesson. They had done this sort of thing before. When New York had refused to obey the act requiring the housing of soldiers in private property, they came down really hard on New York's legislature and wanted to basically said that the legislature could not pass any laws until they changed this ruling, and New York quickly backed down. So in other words, when a state gets out of order or a colony gets out of order, you come down very hard just on that colony. They serve an example to all the other colonies, and everybody gets into line. In this case, the other colonies didn't see this as a cautionary tale. They saw it as, well, we need to stick together and we need to back Massachusetts' continued defiance of this crackdown, or it's going to come hit us all sooner or later. So we hang together or we hang separately. And it really united the colonies in a way of saying, if we don't all stick together and fight this now, it's going to hurt all of us.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. That's another factor that I think is often taken for granted, this emerging collective identity of the colonies that they need to band together to not be exploited. Where does this come about? It seems like that doesn't exist in the 1750s, 1760s. So why is it in the 1770s there is a sense of this collective identity?
It really was an intentional effort. The people who were resisting British policies understood that the individual colony had no way of resisting on their own. The only way they were going to have a chance is if they stuck together. And when all the colonies united to fight the Stamp Act and they won, that showed them, look, when we unite and we feel very strongly about something, we can win. And so they made more of an effort to unite, and they formed the committees of correspondence. These were essentially informal groups. Sometimes they were members of colonial legislatures, but they could have just as easily been private citizens. They informally corresponded with one another on a regular basis. So people in Massachusetts would write people in Virginia and South Carolina, and people in New York would write people in Pennsylvania or whatever. And they got to know each other. They got to know the leaders in the other colonies. They got to know what the issues were in those colonies that they were facing, and they really began to coalesce into a community of common interests.
This just came to my mind. I don't know if you've come across this, but what you described, this otherwise disaggregated group of colonies coming together in one collective identity, this is very similar to what plays out in other places about a century later with Italy, where there are all these little principalities or city-states or papal states of the Republic of Genoa, the Republic of Venice, the Republic of Pisa. And there's a centuries-long effort to unite them and consolidate them into one nation, which does not happen until very late. And in the 19th century, Germany, the same, the Deutschland über alles. The idea is that the nation is bigger than Saxony or Bavaria or whatnot. But this doesn't happen until the 1870s. Have you come across anything of people who are trying these consolidation projects looking at America as an example of how to do this?
I'm not sure America really stood out as an example. I think it's more of a general, when you are facing a common foreign threat, it forces you to put aside your local differences and come together. And I think that's what's happened in each of the cases you've mentioned.
Makes sense. Yeah. Sometimes it's something that just happens. It's not this planned thing. It's a happy accident, I guess.
And the fact that they all share common languages and cultures and stuff, helps a lot in that whole process.
And it's similar. This isn't finished, but many people talk about the Middle East, where you have nations that aren't really nations. They're just sort of put together after World War I, and they're trying to find a common identity. Sometimes they can, different sectarian or ethnic groups can unite together against an external threat, but when they're on their own devices, then it's harder. So this is very much an ongoing story. In terms of planned correspondence, there were bits and pieces of them trying to consolidate and intentional consolidation. And you focus on the committees of correspondence, and they're making organized resistance possible, whereas in the past, in the 1760s, there would not have been a united front, and the ability of a nation, of the United States, to put together a continental army wouldn't have been possible. So what did they do to make organized resistance possible?
Well, one of the main reasons for the committees of correspondence, and they were actually in place long before the Coercive Acts came out, but the colonists realized that London was trying to adopt a policy of divide and conquer. They had repealed the Stamp Act because that had united the colonies, and they said, okay, guys, everything's back to normal, everything's fine, we're all going to be happy friends together again. But then behind the scenes, they started making little changes to the colonial structures here and there. For example, they took over the judiciary in Massachusetts used to be paid for by the colonial governments. Well, Parliament graciously offered to start paying for the courts themselves. And of course, whoever pays the courts is going to be able to call the tune a little bit more. They were basically getting the courts on their side. And they made little changes in other colonies as well. And the colonial government saw this and said, well, wait, they're shifting things here, shifting things there. They're positioning themselves for the next major crisis and making sure they're in a much more powerful position. And so we need to keep track of what they're doing in all the other colonies and how they're making these little tiny changes here and there and how that's going to affect us down the road. And that was really the reason that they wanted to start writing to the other colonies. What's going on in your colony? What changes are happening? What's London doing to you this year that they didn't do to you last year? And that way they would have a better idea of what London's overall strategy was.
I read one historian who said that the loss of the American colonies was one of the biggest blunders in British imperial history, that at every step they refused compromise. They made it impossible to work with them. And Benjamin Franklin, who spent about 10 years in England, arrived as a moderate and left as a radical because he saw that it was completely impossible to work with Parliament at all. Can you see a scenario where England could have effectively prevented a revolution and continued to govern the United States as a colony like it did with Canada and Australia and keep them in the Commonwealth?
Oh, absolutely. If they hadn't overplayed their hand with the Stamp Act and then tried to crush other things as they tried to. There were a lot of things that they tried to implement, very minor taxes that were going to raise almost no money at all. And what we forget is that Britain benefited greatly economically from the colonies without levying a single tax. They set all the trade rules between the colonies and the other countries, and they set them greatly to their advantage. And so they were getting a great deal of raw materials and trade and other things coming into their countries, supporting British manufacturing, which of course the government did tax, so they were indirectly generating revenues from the good economy. they could have continued on that policy and done very well and kept the colonies very happy. And there probably wouldn't have been a fight until probably the mid 1800s when